Namaste everyone, and welcome to our second Vichar Manthan of the year. Our topic of discussion today is elderly who cares. A few points that I'd like to cover before we begin is, if I could ask everyone to switch their phones off so that we have no interruptions through the evening, and the event will be recorded and the video will be live in a few weeks' time so you can have a copy for yourself. For those attending Vichar Manthan for the first time, and even those that have been before, we're an independent voluntary organisation which engages in an open dialogue with members of our society and institutions. VM explores issues facing modern British society through a Hindu civilisational lens. VM now has 5 chapters throughout the UK: Leicester, Nottingham, London Central, London West and Manchester. In the British society, there are very few places where we have the opportunity to have such discussions and debates. So be here today with an open mind and with the idea that I don't know and I'm here to learn. All of you are very welcome to participate and engage in this discussion, so ask your questions, but can I just request that you keep your questions to a minute or less. Tonight we will be exploring who has the moral responsibility to accommodate our increasingly ageing population. I will now hand over to Vidhu Sharma, who's a spoken word poet by passion and marketing professional by day. She has performed in front of audiences across the UK, Mumbai and Dubai, and has recently completed the Tattva authorship programme, where her written work was published, including a critical essay on Western progression is humanity's regression. By day, Vidhu works for financial publishing company Pageant Media, and she is part of the Vichar Manthan West London team.
Namaste everyone. Today we will be exploring the topic, who has the moral duty of care for the elderly in modern British society? I've been joined by a fantastic panel of speakers who I will briefly introduce, and then I will ask them to present their opening statements on the topic. To my far left, we have Craig Bruin. Craig Bruin is head of commissioning for adult social care at Slough Borough Council and has previously worked as a senior manager in a number of London boroughs and a county council. He has a broad range of experience in the social care field and is currently responsible for ensuring that the council has the right services in place to provide care and support to vulnerable people. He is co-chair at the Slough Carers Partnership Board. Mr. Merva Maan. Mr. Merva Maan was involved in the first wave of integration of Indian students into the British schooling system in 1963, having worked with the Indian High Commission, translating when there were just 11 Indian families in Southall. He was a councillor between 1988 and 2014, and Mayor of Slough between 1995 and 1996. He supported the setup of Slough Seniors Organisation in 2006 for the social care of elderly members of the community. Mr. Vijaya Gupta is a senior academic, professor of media studies and a published author. He has taught at several Indian universities and his last posting was at Kurukshetra University. With the support and guidance of Mr. Merva Maan, he established the Slough Senior Citizens Group in January 2006 to promote healthy living for senior citizens and combat loneliness and isolation amongst the elderly. To my right, we have Vishal Shah. Mr. Vishal Shah has been involved in the healthcare sector through a variety of operational, strategic and finance roles over the 15 years. Among his accomplishments in the field, his most recent include being co-founder and director of Banyan Care Group, board trustee and treasurer of Care England, and he also worked in corporate development capacity for Westminster Healthcare. And to my far right, we have Dr. Sachin Nanda, who is the National Coordinator for Vichar Manthan. He has been academically trained in political philosophy and comparative study of Islam and Christianity, and is currently the Strategy Director of private equity-backed companies. Welcome you all to the panel. I'd like you all to just present your opening statement and answering the question, who has the moral care for the elderly in modern British society? So if we could start with you, Ms. Craig G.
It is a very exciting time for adult social care at the moment. There's a lot of things going on in the world, both in terms of legislation and changes in care practice and changes in demographics, which means those of us who work in social care are giving serious consideration to how the social care system will look in the long term. We have an ageing population, and to some extent, the care system that we have at the moment was designed for the demographics that existed 10 or 20 years ago. There is a strong view that that can't last, and a lot of people working in social care at the moment are sitting down and working how best to provide care in the future, and that does mean less building-based care, more care within the community, more support from families, more support from the voluntary sector, and less reliance on the traditional forms of care. And that is happening, and there are trends that you can see in terms of how care is delivered now to how it was. So I'm hoping this is a really, really interesting debate that I can take something from.
First of all, I'd like to thank this organization called Vichar Mansan to organizing this day for the Slough, because the thing is, immigration came from Asian subcontinent in 50s mostly, because that time the people came in this country was mostly Punjab, and later on they came from East Africa. They're mostly from the Gujarat part of the India. The first one in the Punjabis, when they came in, there was a problem with the education because they couldn't speak English. It has to be helped them in industries. Because I was involved since 1957. I came to this country in 1956. When the first murder happened in Leadbrook Grove, we used to march around there for the equal rights. Now we get a problem now because we all gone old in the same time, most of them of Asian origin, and they're getting the same problem. Because first it was the Englishman's problem, now it's everyone's problem. Because we came from where the joint families was in India, because if ladies never used to work, they used to live under the one roof, and someone is there always to look after the elderly. But here, the society is changing to the Western way of life. Instead of joint families, is getting a single families. And where you used to 5 or 6 children, everybody, now you get about 2, maximum 3. And because everybody's working to make a better life and they're moving on. Because I'm 18 now, I got 2 boys also, one lives in Manchester and one lives in Australia. So I know what will be the problem there, how they're going to look after me if I have a problem. And same is applied to everybody here. Because the thing is, now we're going to look in the way how we can help it. It's the responsibility of the local authorities also. And then the first is, it's very hard to tell our people to go to care homes and all that, where the facilities are, because they're always thinking how we always been looked after by the family, why should we like that? Because this is the issue we're going to discuss it tonight, and if you get any question, we'll try to answer it, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Vidhu, for asking us to be here. One thing which strikes me is this is an intergenerational group. This side, yes, here. It is remarkable. You see, if we can organize an event where there is an intergenerational group, it is bound to be great success. So I am very happy to be here, joining you this discussion. Most of my experiences are on the basis of the work that we do on Slough Seniors, which was established in 2006. We started with focusing on health issues, exercises, talks, and other things which promotes health. But during the last 10 years, we have found that more than the health, it is the loneliness and isolation that is troubling the society. It is not a question of Asian society, it concerns the British society as well. Lots of persons do not know, elderly people do not know what to do, how to spend their time. When they come to our group, the first question they tell me is, why do they come? Why do you come to our group? We have several programs, twice a week, going out, giving them opportunities to meet and leisure activities. जैसे घर पे बैठ के क्या करना है? It is very, very difficult. Even if you are living with your family, with your children and grandchildren, they have to go to school. They have to attend to their duties. They have so many social commitments and their employment commitments that they, while living under one roof, but this concept of living under one roof is going out of the window. I've seen it from my own family perspective. But even if you are not living under one roof and you are looking after your parents, it is very difficult, and it is I find it is unfair for us to expect the children to look after us at a time when they are their responsibilities. But at the same time, how do we look after ourselves? If we have that question like that, maybe that we can arrive at some very purposeful conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Namaste, everyone. Firstly, thank you also again to the Vicharamanthan team for bringing this very important topic to this platform. And it's actually extremely encouraging to see all of you here as well, because you're clearly taking interest in this topic as well. And hopefully collectively we can think about this question in the wider context. By introduction, it was given that we also we're a provider. We own a business that provides services for the elderly. And we largely focus on the community that are living with dementia. And over the course of this discussion, I'm sure we can sort of pick up on some topics that actually relate to this as well. But also as a role I have is that I sit on a board of something called Care England. And Care England actually represents the entire sort of independent sector of care services across England, and gives a voice in terms of actually these topics and issues that we're talking about. And what I would like to just bring into context is that this debate is quite timely, in that not only are we thinking about this, but after quite some time now and quite a long process, this is being debated in various forums across government, politics and policy. And just a couple of days ago, there was an announcement that a green paper will be issued now, which is going to be published in summer next year, that will debate this particular topic as well, as to how can we sustain this sector, how can we sustain an aging population. Just to put it into slightly context as well there, is that CQC, which is the Care Quality Commission, it's the main regulatory body that governs and regulates and inspects all care services across the England in that context. They annually produce a report called the State of Care. Well, just recently have started producing this State of Care report. And 2 years back, they described the sector as being at its tipping point. The actual words were the tipping point. And what does that mean is effectively that we have an aging population that is significantly requiring, not only in terms of this aging, but the needs are increasing and becoming more complex. And we're not actually catching up in terms of the growth of how we can support these needs across that. The report that was just produced this year echoed the same sentiment, that actually we are at a tipping point. And I guess this is now a question as to say that actually who provides the care, who has the moral responsibility, as you correctly said. My current answer to that would be that all of us do. But we have to also understand in terms of in what context do we provide that support. And this is where we actually do have to recognize, and I think in many circles we also do this, that it's sometimes very difficult to let go of our elders, and as we do our loved ones, to say that we can no longer care for that person anymore, because their needs are greater than what we can actually sustain, provide. And this is where the debate actually comes into play, that actually we do need to invest in professional skills as well, and our ability to service those needs and help those in with the right skills, so that actually we live a well-being, live with a great life and healthy life, but also understanding what the complex needs are coming as we grow older.
Delighted to be here, and it's good to see actually quite a mix of ages in the audience too. So I'm looking forward to the manthan that transpires. I'm going to take a slightly different approach in the sense that I'm going to give a slightly, what I believe to be a historical narrative as to how I think we ended up here, which is that at some point post-World War II, the British society at large seems to have agreed some sort of social contract where effectively it was decided that the state would become more involved in providing healthcare, but also care for the elderly. And post-1947 and onwards, the state has consecutively got bigger and bigger and bigger, not just in terms of size and revenue, but also its remit. Its responsibility has kept on growing. And the reason why I bring this up is because when we discuss it tonight, we should keep that historical narrative in the back of our mind. And in 1947, the population of Britain was not nearly 70 million, of which 19 million or something to that effect by 2020 will be over 65. Those demographics simply did not exist, and I don't think those demographics were even forecast. So effectively, the state kept on growing. And I suppose the question Vichar Manthan is asking, and Viduji is asking, is it still? Two questions. One is it time to redraw the social contract between the state and the individuals? One. Number two is, if it is, whose moral responsibility is it to take care of the elderly? And throughout this evening, my position will be that the primary role has to be the family unit and the secondary role has to be the state. And I hope to convince you of that by this evening.
We actually have a sixth panelist, but before I go on to introduce who that is, I would just like to reinforce what Rituji said at the beginning about if you have any questions, please keep them to a minimum. Please keep them to a maximum of 1 minute, and please direct your questions to any of the panelists that you'd like to ask. We have a lot to get through today, so the format of the event will be, in the first section, we'll be discussing the scale of the problem, understanding what the problem is, not how we've got to here, but just the nature of the problem. And then in the second section, if you have any questions to do with how we got here historically, culturally, what factors contributed to this situation, that's when we'll be discussing those. So we're going to keep it quite strict with that. And if you ask a question that's not within the section, I will have to ask you to hold on to it and save it for the next section. In the third section, we'll be discussing the dharmic perspective. What is that perspective, that other route? Is it simply black and white, or is there a way of being ethical and practical? And then in the final section of the evening, we'll be discussing discussing a few solutions to the problem, exploring how we can implement those solutions. So I would like to introduce digitally Mr. Vidya Bhaskarji, who is a Sanskrit scholar and acharya of his own ashram in Switzerland, and he's been quite deep in the study of Advaita. So we'll have a short video by him.
Namaste, everybody. So we're talking about this very interesting subject of who is responsible for the elderly. And I'm going to just give you a little bit of a perspective from the ancient Hindu mindset, if we can put it like that. It's very clear that if we look into the Rig Veda, which is the most ancient Hindu scripture, and all the way through the canon, so to speak, the Vedic canon, which includes the Brahmana texts, the Aranyakas, the Upanishads, and then later the Itihasas, which means the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and the Puranas, and that includes the Bhagavad Gita and the Dharma Shastras, the Smritis, all the way down to the modern bhakti literature. When I say modern, I mean from medieval times, and the works, the agamas that were still continue to be written. It becomes very clear that there is an absolute, unambiguous view of who is responsible for the elderly. It is the children. Very clear, 100%. In the ancient Hindu perspective, it is certainly not the state who is responsible. It is certainly not some external factors in society who are responsible. It is the children. But children also means extended family. So it means the younger generation, not 5-year-olds. It means the next generation, the younger generation. This is why in Hindu tradition it was always important to actually have children. Except, of course, sadhus and sannyasis who lived in mattas and ashramas, kind of monastic institutions, and many of whom were traveling on foot. And that's a different aspect. I'll not go into that. But society at large was made up of large families, as it continues to be today. And the responsibility for the elderly lies with the next generation. And for a good practicing Hindu, there is no greater shame in this world than to have an elderly member of the family not looked after. It is impossible to be a practicing Hindu and not look after your elders. And I'll give you a concrete example, if I may, that one of my best friends in this whole world is one of the greatest scholars of Hinduism. He could easily be a professor at the leading universities in the world because of his Sanskrit knowledge. He has memorized about 40,000 verses of Hindu scriptures. He's the sweetest, most humble, most lovely person in the world. And yet, he has no chance whatsoever to go out there and to become famous or to do what he likes, as all of you listeners, as all of you do. You have the chance to do what you like. He doesn't, because he looks after his father. His father is blind, has a disability. He looks after his father. And he's been doing that since he's 15 years old, 16 years old. Non-stop, 24/7, he looks after his father. And that is his duty, it is his dharma. It is that which fulfills him. And there is nothing that can take him away from that. There is no incentive. There is not even the statement, but you could be helping many more people than just one person. Not even that incentive can take him away from that fundamental duty of looking after his father. So you see, that is a true practicing Hindu. Any other Hindu in the world who even has the thought of what should I do about my parents, there's only that answer. It's your duty. The same way your parents looked after you. And even if sometimes in modern society we have parents who might not be the best parents, that's not an excuse. That's not an excuse. And don't get into the psychology of, oh, they didn't look after me so well, so I don't need to look after them so well. That is not an excuse. It is Hindu dharma to look after your parents. Matra Devo Bhava, Pitra Devo Bhava. One of the most famous statements of the Taittiriya Upanishad is that your mother is your deity, your father is your deity. And there's just no ambiguity. You can't argue anyway. It's your duty. Now, of course, in a modern context, we can say, well, if there is something like a home for the elderly, and if it is a dignified place, and if you still can go and look after your parents, if you can ensure their well-being, if you can visit them as much as you can, and if you can make sure that they still are included in the family, that you still take them home, that they're still part of your family, that they're not isolated. If you can justify it yourself, this is one of my statements I keep saying, if you can justify it for yourself, if you can say that that is really looking after them, that is really their well-being, then that's fine. There are such homes in Switzerland. I once visited a home in Switzerland, and I would have moved in there. It was so beautiful. I mean, it was an apartment overlooking the mountains, the Alps. I would have moved in there right away. And I joked and I said, can I apply? Can I live here? Very, 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 very beautiful place. So if it's a place where that's really dignified, where they're really looking after them well, then it's okay. I think it's justified. I don't think we need to say that a home for the elderly is not Hindu. I don't think that works. I mean, in the UK, you've got funding. Why not create homes for Hindu elderly people where they can live their Hindu life, where they can live Hindu dharma in the most dignified way, where they can do their sandhya, where there's a priest, where can people to talk to, maybe where younger people who give them the sense of dignity that they deserve. But if you, the children, are not there to give them the feeling that they are still parts of your family, not just part of the family, they are the heads of your family. They are the adhyaksha. They are the mukha of the family. If you're not there to do that, then you're not a practicing Hindu. You're doing something then, but you're not a practicing Hindu. So my message is really, there is no ambiguity, and please don't try to cherry pick some views and some stories that seem to portray a different picture. That's the ancient Hindu view, and it'll be the view of Hinduism in the future. So thank you very much. I hope this was an inspiration for you. Thank you.
So our thanks to Vidya Bhaskarji for that insight into the Dharmic perspective. Just let your eyes readjust. So I'm going to kick off the discussion with a question. Again, to remind you, this is an interactive session. Please feel free to raise your hand, make yourself known if you have a question to ask. In this first section, again, we'll be talking about the scale of the problem, the nature of the problem, really getting to grips with what the problem is. So I have a few statistics for you panelists, and I'd like your thoughts on them. So these two statistics, one is from an Age UK report, and the other is from The Observer. And the first one is 800,000 of the 2 million older people who have been diagnosed with care-related needs do not receive any formal support from private or public sector agencies. Just for everyone to have a little think about that. It's quite a shocking statistic because it's about 60% of our elderly population with care-related needs do not receive any support. And the other is those councils that have been tasked with care of the elderly, 77 out of 152 have had at least one residential nursing care provider closed within the last 6 months. Just to give you a slight insight into the scale of the issue. Panelists, do you have any comments on those statistics? Craig G?
I think a very interesting video. I was very interested to hear what other people were saying. And actually, I think one of the things that I was thinking as this coming along is this such a black and white issue in terms of it's either this or it's this? Because the way that social care works is that we look at we look at the carer, we look at the person who needs care, and we look at the care and the carer. So our job as professionals is to make sure that the person who needs the care has the right care. Now, it's not unlimited, and there's no automatic right to go into a care home. You go into a care home normally if you've got quite serious needs, dementia, and need nursing care. Most people who haven't reached the higher levels of care are getting care from their families, they are getting care from their communities and from their neighbours and from wider networks. So it is actually moving in that direction anyway. And that's partly not for moral reason, that's partly for economics and for the fact that people these days desire more choice and they want more companionship and value companionship far more than they value the formal care. So I'm not surprised at those statistics because I think that is the direction of travel anyway.
Sure, and a few comments from the Slough Senior Citizens Group. What is the scale of the issue? What do you see on a day-to-day basis? What kind of issues are you seeing daily from those elderly members of our community who aren't receiving any care? What are they saying and what is their experience? We'd like to just have a few comments.
The problem is becoming a central problem of the society. It was not so about 10 years back. It is becoming more and more difficult every day. The situation is changing. The greed of the people in the society is increasing. The government is abdicating its responsibility. The family, which means children and grandchildren, may find it very, very difficult to cope with. As I had explained in my opening statement, we can't blame them. I would not blame my children and grandchildren in spite of the fact that this is the time when we need support. However, it is not a problem where you can say black and white solution. And I wanted to say to Vidhu, instead of using this word dharma, you could have used this word sanskar. That would have been better. Because dharma also has sometimes two. Dharma means duty, but at the same time, dharma is also related to religion. But sanskar means your background, your upbringing, what you can. People with good sanskar will never let the respect for their parents go. But unfortunately, even dharma and even sanskar, these things, these concepts, understanding is changing very fast. Sometimes when I look at the society, the rate of the change is mind-boggling. And internet has created a rift between the two generations. And well, we depend on it. I would be very happy to receive a lot of guidance and help from my grandson and son, but we don't live here. If you have, we really need the help of the younger generation. If we want to tackle internet, new technologies, you just can't go, can't do without internet. And whatever you might do, you will never become, I will never become a competent professional as my 10-year, 11-year grandson is. We need interdependence of the two generations more than ever before.
Thank you. But I would like to argue that on a Saturday night, we have so many youngsters in the audience.
Yeah.
The entire Vichar Manthan teams are built up of youngsters that are trying to make our British experience, the way that we solve British issues, a more dharmic way, whether that is a more with a better understanding of sanskara or dharma. I would argue that it's both. And also, I'm connected with Vidalaji on Facebook. I'm connected with Panditji on LinkedIn. I would like to think that maybe the digital age has boosted that connection in a way and bridged those gaps in a lot of ways. And it's maybe easier to connect with different generations. Just to counter your point there. Sachinji, do you have any points on anything to say on okay, or Vishalji, do you have anything to say on what Vijayji has just said?
I think there's a few things. I mean, also just going back to your statistics that you suggested, because I think it's interesting to actually understand the statistics a little bit more. At the moment, we do have an aging population. I think we're talking about, with you suggested 800,000 people don't receive. You know, there are some statistics suggesting that there are 1.2 million older people that actually don't have their needs met in some ways. But if you think about the scale of the problem, the actual care sector as a whole, there are actually 460,000 roughly care home beds across the whole country. This sector, you know, across 19,000 locations, there's about 8,500 domiciliary care providers that try to provide care at home as well. And actually, as a sector, you know, if you think about it, there are roughly 1.6 million people that work daily to help those in the social care sector. But the problem is actually that the crux of it, all of it, is also the fact that we have, as you live longer, there come a few other issues as you live longer as well. And I think this is where we need to understand the concept of, you know, how do we actually manage that process? You know, there's something called the old age dependency ratio that the Office of National Statistics tend to look at. And it talks about the working population, 16 to 64, versus those of older age. And what's the ratio there? Because fundamentally, if we go by this concept, it's that age population that's going to help and support the older population as well. But that statistic is getting skewed the wrong way, increasingly because of age increasing. And as you see, when we talk about age increasing, we're talking in 30 years' time. At the moment, there's 11.8 million people that are considered over the age of 65. In 30 years' time, that will reach 20 million, close to 20 million people. And so how do we support that? Now, some issues that which are talked about here is actually about family structures in some ways as well. Because actually the average family structure now is 2.8, the size is about 2.8 people now. So 2.8 means roughly under 3. And so when you talk about the dependency ratio, how are we supposed to do that when we're living in a society as well where this younger generation are hitting a debt-driven society where they're constantly having to work? We've got a balance between actually sustaining family versus also meeting the needs of that particular family. But at the same time as well is that as you age older, the quality of life changes slightly as well, because not only are you aging, you could also there's more prevalence of chronic conditions as well. So I mentioned dementia at one point actually before, and dementia actually has now become the biggest killer over heart disease. You know, it's practically, you know, suggested that actually if you're going to, a cause of death this year is overtaken heart disease. And actually, as a provider of dementia services myself, I see the troubles that many families go through when they actually have an elderly member or even a younger member now, because younger onset dementia comes into play as well. That how do you manage that individual's needs in the best way they possibly can? And this is where it really becomes actually no family wants to shift the care of their loved one. I think it's daily when we see families come to even our care services, that actually the biggest issue that, the thing they have to tackle, the first thing is guilt. You know, that level of guilt, saying that actually, do I really want to, send my loved one to the care? But the problem is that they get to a point where the crisis or the way that they can manage care at home, the safety and well-being of that individual becomes difficult. And that's a really important factor to understand, because as much as we want to, as a generation, want to have the capacity to actually help and support our older population, we also need the skill set and the understanding of how to manage that, to make sure that that individual is well looked after, well-being is looked after, etc. And that also causes the factor of loneliness as well. And let me take that factor, sorry, if you don't mind if I extend, but that 2.8 average size family, If you think about it in that context, in that 2.8, naturally the person who's of younger age is still probably more likely going to go have to work, right? Now, if there's elderly living at home, yes, you retain them within your household, but for about 8 to 10 hours of that day, what do? Yeah, most of the time, they may not have transport to go anywhere. They don't have the systems around them where they can actually interact with people. You know, certainly those that are over aged of 85 or close to there may not have the technological capacity to connect with people through social media and things like that. So then services become important. You know, actually, how do we help? And talking about our community a little bit in this, I've seen now more and more services come up now that actually do cater for our community a little bit more. And I went to visit one in Harrow, which is a wonderful service. And the interesting statistic about that was actually what I came away from it was those that actually came to the home, the team there were actually saying that when they first came into the home, they were considered malnourished in terms of their physical weight and well-being. And this is a bit of, it's not intentional neglect, it's just the fact that the system, the way that they were looked after in that environment meant that actually they weren't coming with the right level of nourishment that they need for that particular level of age. And within 2 months of living in an environment where there's communal living, where there's friendship, where there's companionship, where there's activity, that statistic changed dramatically, where they were extremely nourished. Nutrition needs became better. So it's in that way where we actually have to balance sometimes the concept of actually how do we look after so that we can look after our elder, but also understand that sometimes the well-being of that individual needs to come into play. And we need to understand how that comes as well. And
could you just, I know you've had 2 minutes, but no, I just wanted to ask what the stigma is behind care homes within, typically the Hindu community, but then on a broad scale in British society. What are some of the issues that you've had with convincing people of what you were just saying about how they are actually performing much better in an environment around elderly people like themselves?
I think that it's interesting because actually I feel that the noise and what comes out a lot of the time through media as well. And I think unfortunately the perception of care across everything tends to be more negative than it is positive. There are more negative stories that come out about social care than there is positive stories. And I think that stigma has its own place. Before, I think historically it used to be the context of people thinking that if you're going to go to an old age home, you're going there to die. Effectively, this is your end of life care. You know, you're effectively going home and you're actually sending someone off to die. And that's what the stigma is. They actually think that an old age home is a place for death, effectively. And that's the wrong impression, actually, because actually when you talk about this in the context of communities and being able to actually have that well-being nature, it's actually a place to live. And we really are trying to transform that quite a bit, because when you start looking at how you can actually cater for that individual's person-centered care, the actual individual's needs, you actually start realizing that well-being can be great. And in fact, I'll give you an example that in the care home we have right now, the average age of length of stay that used to be in a care home before used to be about 6 months to a year, because they used to come at that point of where actually earned a meal. We have about 60% of our residents living for 12 to 13 years and are still going strong. And that is because the shift in their own well-being has moved forward in that perspective, because they're actually living longer, healthier, with the right companionship, etc. So I think there is a definite change in which we need to think about in terms of care is not a place for death, but it's a place for living. I think also the breadth, just to add to that, the breadth of offering now has changed. I think historically there used to be the case, and this is where legislation has come into play, where from 1948 legislation started to come into play to protect the most vulnerable in society, and hence used to create facilities for the most vulnerable, for when mental health issues were very prevalent and very severe. But that's moved quite considerably because the category has changed. But actually the breadth of care services now that are there are actually from those coming with choice to say, I want to live in an assisted living kind of environment where I have like-minded people, but when I need care, I have that care available. To those that actually genuinely feel that the safety and security of their own houses is no longer there, but want to live in a safe environment, to then also providing care at home. So I think what's changed now over the years is that actually the access points that you have for care have dramatically changed. And I think when we go on the topic of dharmic perspective, which I have a very strong view on as well, this is something which we shouldn't shy away from. It's actually part and parcel, as Vidya Bhaskarji said in his quote, that as long as the quality of that service is there, actually what you're doing is supporting the well-being of that individual, which is so important in all of this.
Very interesting thought. A care home is not a place to go and die, it's a place to go and live. So let's just unpack the initial question then. Not the initial question. why we have arrived at this situation, why we are in this issue historically through a legislation. Sachin mentioned earlier that the social construct that was agreed post-World War II, where it was kind of assumed that if you paid taxes and supported the elderly, when it finally came to your time being amongst the elderly, that you would then be looked after. But it seems that the boomer generation before us broke that rule almost. It was almost as if we've got ours, we wanted ours at the expense of yours. And so there are a few, I mean, personally from my experience coming, and for a lot of people here being second or third generation immigrants, we've seen our parents immigrate over here, we've seen them assimilate, adapt, give their children the best that they can possibly give, educate us so that we can have a better life than themselves. But I understand that we only accommodate less than 5% of the British population, and the other 95% of the population do have a slight bitterness towards their parents' generation for systematically voting in governments that voted against them, that implemented austerity, that rose house prices, increased tuition fees. There is this kind of underlying question in a lot of people in my generation, that why should we now give you sympathy when you had no empathy for us? Could you share some thoughts on that, on why this generation should now be accommodating for a generation that didn't accommodate for them? Craig, did you have anything to add?
Well, it's not the current generation, is it? I mean, that's the issue. The ageing population is actually you. And I'm in my 50s, and I'm aware that when I reach 80, there will be a lot of people my age still alive who will be requiring care. We will predominantly be cared for within the community because the care home sector is not going to expand to accommodate us. So my hope for my generation is that we can create community-based services to allow us to live at home, not become socially isolated, and have the various medical issues that go associated with being socially isolated. But when you become my age, it's going to be vastly different, and the care system will look nothing like the one that I need for my care. It's going to look incredibly different. I don't think you can rely on children, and I think that's the difficulty is, as we pointed out, families are getting smaller, houses are getting smaller, there are more family units. So where children can and are willing to look after their parents, I think that's a good thing. And I know people in their 60s and 70s who still look after their parents in the local community in Slough. So it goes all the way through the generations. But where that isn't there, we have to make sure there is something there for people of your generation who may well be isolated and on your own when you're in your 80s.
And just to reiterate the growing ageing population, between 2004 and 2014, the number of people aged over 85 increased by 2/3. There was 630,000 people. It's quite a shocking statistic. The system that we currently live in wasn't designed to accommodate such a small working population and such a large elderly population. It was actually the opposite. When this was implemented after World War II, we were supposed to have a huge working population and a very small elderly population. So why is it that we are now living longer, and why is it that we have such a vast elderly population? A couple of the social issues that you picked up on is that we're marrying later. The average age of marriage in this society now is 30. And the look of shock on some of your faces tells me that my grandmother was married at 16 years old, and that was just a cultural thing back then. Some of the other things that we're experiencing is that we're having children a lot later. Medicine means that people are living a lot longer. I'd like to open it up to the floor. If you have any questions for any of the panelists, before we move on to the next section of the discussion, if you have any questions to do with why we are here, how we are here, and what the nature of the issue is,
Can I just say one more thing?
Sure.
Can I just say something about the role of paid carers and unpaid carers? Because we have a lot of paid carers and a lot of unpaid carers. Paid carers don't get paid a great deal. And one of the issues about keeping people at home and keeping people in care homes is you need to expand the labour market to actually pay for people. Now, there are parts of the country, and I think Slough is probably one of them, where we're quite dependent on immigrant labour to actually provide care. Now, it's not typical across the whole of England, But I think in certain parts of it, it is. And one of the issues with Brexit, because a lot of these people come from Eastern Europe, is there's going to be a shortage of labour to provide care even now. So in the longer term, as the population ages, if there are more paid carers required, that means a lot of people need to choose to be paid carers. And at the moment, it's not a profession that has a great deal of status, and it doesn't pay a great deal. So one of my pleas is that people who care, whether you're paid for or not, whether you're earning money for doing it or not, you need to be celebrated and have a degree of status, because if that doesn't happen, then I think people will back off whether they're paid to do it or not. And I think that is a real serious issue going forward. As people are old, the younger generation who aren't caring for their parents may well find themselves caring for somebody else and being paid a fairly low wage with poor employment prospects and not a great deal of status. And I think that's the key thing that has to change to make this work.
So what is it that the government can do to incentivise becoming a paid carer? How can we make that a more promising, a more appealing career path?
Well, the one thing that always works is paying people more. And at the moment, I mean, in Bracknell, I was told, I don't know if this is true, it's an anecdotal story that I was told by somebody in Bracknell. They've just regenerated their town centre, and they are really worried that the shops and the coffee shops that are opening in Bracknell town centre will become a more attractive option for people than working in the care industry, and that's going to cause a major problem for people going forward in terms of recruiting for these agencies. And that is simply down to money. And there are people who will change agencies because their pay goes up by 50p. And so you're talking about that level of money. I mean, are there many people here who are thinking of becoming a home carer or a care home worker as a profession? And it's a lot to do with, I mean, a lot to do with how much you think that you'll earn. You'll probably think, actually, I aspire to earn more than a care worker earns. And so changing terms and conditions, making sure people get paid properly. They're paid from the point at which they start work at the start of the day to the point at which they end, including their travel time. And they are given proper pensions, and they're given proper training to enable themselves to move on if they actually want to. So it's basic labour law, basically, give people a decent working environment to work in and allow for the fact that it is a difficult job, and they need to form some sort of relationship with the people they're caring for it to be successful. Otherwise, you may as well send in a robot. So it is just about celebrating people and paying them more. I don't think it's really a great deal more than that.
Mervaji, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'm going to add something.
It's on.
Thank you, Craig, for giving all this information. But the thing is, main concern is the finance. Central government is complying. There's no money for the health services. They're short of the millions. And as you from the Slough Borough Council, I ask you just for the local area, how much extra funding you get every year for looking after the care for the elderly in Slough in the budget? Because the thing is, it's cutting down every year, because I've been a councillor 26 years, and every time we complain, we had the centres where the elderly used to go around, they're all been shut. They say you run it yourself. And the council is cutting down, and there's no facilities there. So how are we going to go on that one?
I mean, it is. I mean, one of the difficulties of the debates. One of the difficulties of the debates at the moment is the financial position we find ourselves in because of the times of austerity. And one of the most exciting pieces of legislation that's been brought forward in the UK recently is the Care Act, and the Care Act just happened to come in at a time at which local authorities were being cut. Social care services in local government are being reduced in total spend because local government spend is being reduced. There's no targeting of social care. And to some extent, social care spend is protected because there are cost pressures and there are demand pressures. So although spend on social care in Slough and the rest of the country is falling in real terms, it's not as falling as much as it is in the rest of the council. So the task for us is to try and remodel the system. We don't just want to do less, we have to do it differently, which is one of the reasons I came today and why this debate is so interesting, because we have to do it differently, because there is a finite number of people who will work to do care. We are trying to move away from building-based places. We're trying to move away from the more expensive types of care, whilst trying to target services on people's needs and provide more support for unpaid carers. And we have a situation now where anybody who is an unpaid carer can actually apply to the council for an assessment to enable their needs to be met and receive a direct payment, as the client themselves can receive a direct payment and find a more cost-effective way of meeting their needs without the old-fashioned way of the council coming and doing it for you. So we are trying to change the way we do it and give people more choice. And it is true resources are constrained. and they will be for some time. I don't think the council's budget will stop reducing for at least another 3 years. And that's the point at which our financial forecasts say it's a stable situation. And that stable situation will mean a care system that is different if we're to meet the demand, because our population will be significantly higher for older people at that time.
Yeah, thank you.
Austerity has been one of the most talked about and discussed happening in the country during the last 10 years. And we cannot quarrel with it. Conditions are hard, things are not doing very well. But I have found that in the name of austerity, the elderly people have been hit hardest. I couldn't believe that when the Milan Center was closed. I couldn't believe. Lots of people are coming to us. I said, they come to us with the news that this day center has discontinued its activities. Even very well-known organizations like Age Concern are reducing their activities because they are not getting grant from the local government. They can't raise funds. Even the voluntary sector organizations which have been struggling so hard, they are doing their very best. They can do only so much. So the situation is not that easy. And I don't know, but I have a feeling that the elderly people have been unjustified recipients of austerity measures.
Thank you for that. John V. Ben, did you have a question to ask one of the panelists? Just to repeat the question, why do we use such negative words when we talk about the elderly? Why do we not see it as more a pleasure? I'm not sure if you or anyone in the audience saw that these programs like Secret Life of 4-year-olds, when they merged it with an elderly care home. At the beginning of the documentary, they had asked the members of the care home if they could run to the other end of the room, and almost all of them refused and said they couldn't possibly get up. They didn't have the energy for it, nor did they want to. But after a week of being around nursery children, the one who was the most against getting up and doing anything physical was running with one of the little girls and having the time of his life. His energy, his health had improved. Everyone in the care home had noticed it. Why are we not associating looking after the elderly with words like pleasure? Do you have anything to add, Sachin?
Just a point on language. So I couldn't agree more, by the way. And there's some fundamental things that I want to bring in, and I think we're kind of creeping towards that part of the section, so I'm going to jump in there with it, which is this notion, a couple of notions that Vidya Bhaskar mentioned that I want to kind of emphasize and maybe get us to reflect on. A couple of things. So one is this notion of dignity. The notion of dignity I believe, has to play a central role in our conversation. Number two is this notion of head of the family. Within the Dharma traditions, the elderly are the heads of the family. And I think Vidya Bhaskar said it rather articulately. And I think that somewhere in our journey as a society, we've kind of started to see them as almost baggage or, had-beens. Done a pretty decent job, but now it's our turn. Step to the side, please, and we'll look after you as best as we can. And that narrative has to change. And I think it is a structural problem in the society, and it does stem from our language and our upbringing and the kind of information that's thrown at us constantly. And the third thing I want to pick up on the language is that within most philosophical schools that are Hindu, and I class Hindu broadly in the sense of Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, Jain, etc., you will find the word tyag, not sacrifice. The Hindu world has no notion of sacrifice, actually, because sacrifice is seen as something that just look at the psychological language. If I say I sacrificed a chocolate bar to look after you, it means I wanted a chocolate bar, but look, I gave it up so I could look after you. That's not the Hindu ethos in any sense. It's the word tyag. Now, tyag is a state of being. Individual reaches a state of awareness where they realize that this the division between myself and my parents is not that there is them and I, that it is just us. And therefore the desire for the chocolate bar would just disappear, and it becomes an honor and a sense of, I don't like the word duty, but a sense of commitment to oneself and the other simultaneously. So it's not that you're giving up things to look after the elderly. It's that actually you raised your state of being so that you realize that they are me, I am them. And that's a whole different state of being. There's no sacrifice in that. There's no giving up in that. So this notion of tyag has to play a central role in these conversations, I believe. Not sacrifice. So dignity, heads of the family, tyag. And finally, I want to just pick up on the point about the status of carers. I think there is a fundamentally value-based problem in our society, and I won't go into it because it's not part of our remit, but there is something to be said about the fact that carers, teachers, nurses are so poorly paid. To me, anybody who is who works in these roles should have the highest status. They should be the brightest. They should be the most respected. So there is a structural problem in our society that is that is beyond language. It's actually something at the very heart of our society and the values that our society stands for. And when I say now our society, I'm thinking about the wider British, the whole society. So these are some of the things that I would like us to contemplate on.
So, would that be practical?
What would be practical? So let me just ask everybody here, hands up whose aspiration it is to be a carer. Hands up. Whose aspirations is it here to be a carer? 1, 2. No. This man, he owns care homes. He's not a carer. Let's get it right, okay? No. Let's just say Craig, maybe you can enlighten us. What's the pay for a carer? The average pay? Living wage. It's the living wage. And what's the living wage? $7.20. Okay, $7.20 an hour is what our society values that a carer should be paid. Now, when I say our society values, I'm not being emotive, I'm being structural. There is a capitalist structure behind this, which means that there is a certain supply and demand equation going on here, which is making the people that we ought to value more devalued in monetary senses. What I'm suggesting is far more subtle. Same with teachers, same with nurses. There is a structural problem, but that structural problem is underpinned by a value basis. There is a reason why the brightest guys that came out of university with a first class go into banking and investment banking and finance, and they don't go into teaching, or they don't go into caring. There's a reason for it. And it's not that they're immoral or that they don't have a sense of duty. There's a structural element to this. It is how we judge each other and as a society, and also how we reward these individuals. And I think there's something to be said about that. I'm not proposing any solutions, of course, but I'm asking us just to merely innovate and think. And my final point before I pass it back to Vidhu is that I think it was Einstein, and I may be caricaturing it, but he said, the very worldview that created the problem cannot solve it. So the very worldview that created these problems cannot solve it. We have to think in a completely different, in an original sense, to evolve. I'm not talking about a revolution, but to evolve out of this problem.
So it seems it's a problem that is inherent to capitalism in its purest form. Prithvi, do we have one question for any of the panelists? Yes. Just to repeat the question, to what extent is the housing market responsible and why is that not being talked about?
Actually, this is a point that I'm quite passionate about as well in terms of actually policy, because unfortunately we live in a world which, again, firstly, if it comes across now that we compartmentalize lots of issues, and we tend to put them into boxes and actually then put as much language as has been highlighted here against that box. And this comes across again in policy making as well. And now at the moment we're in a situation where we keep talking about a housing crisis. And actually, if you think about it, if everyone started talking to each other, there's a solution to this. Because if you talk about the housing crisis, in particular London, if you look at it, we keep talking about affordable housing is required and needed to build a bricks and mortar just to service those that are going to be first-time buyers. But actually, no one's thinking about the spectrum of housing in this context, actually, and how kind of the one obviously issue is the community in which it's created, but also the fact that actually, if there are about, and there is a statistic here, so there's about 3.6 million older people living alone at the moment, about 3.6 million across. And if you think about that, actually, when we talk about planning for housing, we do need to actually address that issue as well. And when we start looking at the context of why housing crises come about, my view on this actually is a very dharmic view as well, is that actually there is a fundamental behavior that we have in society where when you come of a working age, your intention is then to flop the nest. Yeah? It is kind of frowned upon sometimes to say that actually you're still living at home, because actually you're working of a working age, and why are you not flocking the nest and standing on your 2 feet and all this? And actually, when you realize that actually what we're trying to fuel in terms of the housing crisis is sometimes in the context of actually single individuals trying to find a house for themselves to live in with 2 bedrooms, right? And how on earth is that society supposed to develop when you actually go into that kind of context of planning? So actually, a big passion, I as I said, I sit on various lobbying boards as well, in terms of, is actually one about planning and housing, and I've had these debates. It's saying you need to think of a much wider perspective on housing. And our view in terms of where we want to sort of develop services is where actually the elders aren't shipped off so that the youngers can come in, where housing policy isn't such that actually the elderly accommodation goes to the outskirts and the urban centres get filled with younger generations. It's actually about mixing those generations together. And you see that really well done in Singapore, actually. And Singapore model, I think, someone correct me properly, because it's only in sort of parts of comment I've heard it, but they create sort of housing communities. And after 20 years, I think it is, or something, they get knocked down. And they get rebuilt again. But in that community of the housing, it's a complete mix. You don't have just one generation living in it. Actually, the whole idea is that you create mixed communities and mixed environments. And this isn't important, in fact, actually, because quite rightly, that if we help in society, community, then it actually helps each other. The dharmic point of this as well, and I just want to add to this point about looking after our parents. I completely fulfill that wish, and I completely agree with that. But there's also capacity as well of that individual that needs to be taken into context, no matter what. And not every single individual is the same. Not every single individual has the capacity to be able to look after the elders in the way that they should be looked after for the well-being of that individual. And when I say look after, I don't mean in the context of just being their carer. I'm talking about having that, the way we talked about just now, this context of living together, highest level. Everyone has respect for their parents. I don't discount the fact that we keep transferring love for our parents elsewhere. But there is one other perspective we can take, which is that of Vasudeva Kutumbakam. And this is when we take the context of the whole world is one family. And actually what that really to me means is that actually we should start developing communities where everyone looks after everyone. Not just the fact that your own sibling, your own children looked after their own parents. We need to create some communities where people who have the capacity help and develop those communities as well, and everyone looks after each other. And one concept of that is actually, I don't know, you can debate this actually whether you want to or not, but we always use this phrase where sharing is caring. Sharing is caring is caring. Turn it the other way around, actually, why can't caring be shared as well? Yeah, and when I say caring, I don't mean love shifting. I don't mean the fact that you're going to actually give up the love for that affection for that person. But sometimes we need to develop communities where actually, when you do live in the housing environment we're talking about, where everyone do circulate better, there's different generations there, everyone generally looks after each other. And that's the way society should be, where everyone really does look after each other. So that's just a point.
So yeah, it brings us quite naturally on to discussing the dharmic perspective. I hope we've got a broad understanding of what the situation is, what the issues are that we face, and how we've come to this. We're just going to have a short 5-minute break if anyone wants to go to the bathroom, and when we return we'll be exploring the dharmic perspective, some of those solutions and how we can start to implement them in modern British society. So we'll be meeting back here at 7:17. Thank you for joining us again. In this final section we'll be exploring the dharmic perspective in more detail. What are some of the solutions to the elderly crisis that we face, and how can we practically implement them into the society that we live in? So just before we get into the new questions, I just want to run through some of the questions we got over the break. I think this is open to all the panelists. Would art therapy be effective in improving the quality of life of elderly people?
Certainly. I mean, I think we've seen it firsthand, actually, where art therapy has been a very useful tool. It actually helps with all aspects of cognitive behaviour, and it helps channel various aspects. So, yeah, definitely. I mean, in terms of art therapy, I would actually support that as much as possible in all formats.
And if I can say so, as a spoken word artist, I see more and more that the audiences that I perform in front of are becoming, like, it's not just young people, it's not just millennials that have got too much time on their hands and a lot of avocado toast to eat and nowhere to go after work and just decide to go and ramble thoughts that eat down the mic at each other. We are seeing more and more a lot of older people that are joining the audiences and really getting involved in this cohesion of traditional poetry and rap music, and it's amazing to see. And so another question we received over the break is, can we please differentiate the terms? Can we please differentiate between care home and hospice? I think this will be a question for you again.
Well, actually, so in the context of care home, so care home is actually considered still a residential home. So it's a place where you live, as I said so before. So instead of your home effectively being in an apartment or a house, you've making a conscious decision, or a decision has been made to actually say you will live in a care home. And actually doesn't change is the fact that it just helps and you manage the well-being of yourself. Hospice has a different, and usually there's something called palliative care and end-of-life care. So when you're generally coming to a stage where you are considered to be coming to the end of life as such, and you'll find that especially in terms of cancer, for example, that there's a number of cancer-related hospices. There are other types of hospices, but you know that actually coming towards the end of your life, where you want to maintain your end-of-life care, so they have you've got sort of a planned process in which you're actually seeing the last days, but actually in a very fulfilled and well being as well. So there's two differences there, where the hospice tends to take the approach of end-of-life care. A care home is about actually a place where you can still live, but with the support that you may require to live with the well-being in mind.
Thank you. And I think this is a question for Satyanji. Living in the UK, have we become and taken on the British Western attitudes of individualism and forgotten about family duty, sanskar, dharma? It's a two-part question. Therefore, should Hindus be more assertive about their heritage?
I think I understand the sentiment behind the question. But if I may be brave enough to reframe it before I answer it. Okay. So I think there is something to be said. Again, we talked about values earlier. I think all of us, and I mean every single one of us, is bombarded by a certain set of memes that permeates in everything we do and everywhere we go. It's in our workplace, it's in our schools, it's in through our television, our radios, the internet. Wherever there is information, there is these collective set of memes those memes are the individual memes. Those memes that basically that encourage us to think of ourselves as an individual. Of course, the irony of that is that the word individual means indivisible. It actually means the one who is a part of the whole. But now, in modern society, we take individualism to mean me, myself, and I at the center of the universe. So that is certainly a meme that resonates in every single space we visit, privately and publicly. And that is a concern. So I think that sentiment I completely get. The second one, it's consumerism, consumptionism. You, even before a citizen, are a consumer. There used to be a time where our politicians would call us citizens. Now they call us consumers. So that is to say that your primary role as a human being now to serve the British society is to go shopping. That is a meme that is permeated in every single walk of life. And it festers in our bellies, it festers at the back of our minds, it talks to our most basic, base human nature that you are important, you should get that top, you should buy that car, you should go on that holiday, you deserve this, you deserve that. And what that does is that it corrodes systematically the idea that I am actually just a unit of a whole. And therefore I must spend, and I am responsible, and I do have an active role to play in the whole, the samaj, whether that's family, whether that's my neighbors, or even the wider public. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question in that sense. So I agree that I think that is the challenge, but I think that challenge is for everybody, absolutely everybody. To your point about should the Hindu values assert itself, I think is what was framed. I want to suggest that actually these sorts of discussions amongst all of us here and the different viewpoints we come. I think the problem is and will become so acute that these discussions, ideas, will challenge the status quo. And we're doing that here by the very nature of having this discussion. So I think that's happening. I think we are beginning to question this notion of being a consumer. I want to be more than a consumer. I want to be more than an individual. I want to feel a sense of belonging in my community. And so these things we're beginning to now challenge.
So it seems we've completely dissected the issue and why we're here. So what are the solutions? The Caring Crisis report that we researched provided a few solutions, financial solutions. We could, Theresa May could stick to her promise in March, putting state-funded system on a more secure, stable and sustainable footing. We can throw money at the situation. We can start to value carers more. But it seems that there is a deeper rooted problem here, and that is that we need to change our mindsets. So where do those solutions lie? How can we change our mindsets? Craig, do you have something to add on that?
I wasn't, and it really comes from the conversation we were having in the break, which was actually this, as a local authority, we operate under law. We have statutory duties. There are statutory needs that we have to make, statutory services we have to provide, and we are remodelling the system because the current system is broken and can't support the generation that's going to be coming behind mine. But we are constrained because we have to follow the law and we have to follow statute and we have to meet the needs of everybody. So there's only so much that we can do. And I think public services need people to do something without us. We can't remodel the entire system. And if we look at the original conversations we were having about family and children's and who takes responsibility, where does the morality sit? Well, a public agency doesn't really have any morality. It's a collection of people, and it's morality of the people. We can't have that moral discussion because we can only do something that is bureaucratic, which is to try and redesign an entire health and social care system from the top down. But there's a limit to what we can do. And that's really where this comes in, really. So what do you do that we can't, which adds to it or replaces it?
So there isn't a limit to what we can do then?
You see, yes, the state can definitely do more, but it has responsibility to the other sections of the society. It has to meet everyday challenges, competing challenges from different sections of the society. We can't say you look after only the older people and don't look after the other sections of the society, the students, the younger people, the other demands they have to meet. Then the other thing is our children. Should not be they looking after us? Yes, they can do more if they are not already doing more, but we should never forget that they have their own challenges to meet, challenges of the modern life. They have their own, they have children. You see, we have children, but our children have their own children. They have to look after the education of the children. They have to meet their own expectations. Their life is not easy anymore. There are no jobs like we had, pensionable jobs, working in the university, going about writing seminars and giving solutions to the world to make it look better, only theoretically. When you come to practical solutions, things are not that easy. So what can be done? My solution to the older people is let them take the responsibility for themselves to the extent they can. We cannot expect the society, we cannot expect our children to do more than what they have been doing. Apart from their limitations, we cannot, changing the mindset is very, very difficult. It takes you so many years and you may fail. And when a son is married to a daughter from another family, it is so difficult to. We expect that our granddaughter should help us, give us more respect. But our granddaughter might have her own concepts, her own sanskars, her own ideals. We should not expect too much from them at the same time. So the elderly people should be looking after themselves more and more. When I was a student in graduation, I had one small couplet from Tennyson, from a poem Ulysses. That was a story where some mariners were marooned in the sea and they did not know what to do. So the ideal situation was, and they were all old, almost 90 years. And the advice to do them was, old age had yet its honor and its toil. Some work of noble note may yet be done, but strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. My message to the older people, let us keep on doing. Let us do whatever we can. Let us explore the world beyond what we had been doing now. And do not blame, do not get into the culture of blame, either to the younger generation or to the state. All of them have their obligations. Let us do our own obligations to ourselves.
Thank you. Nice thought. We have one question over there, and then I'll come to you straight after. So just to repeat the question, what is the responsibility of businesses? Any of the panelists? Does that particularly resonate?
that was very succinct, I thought. Very good. I couldn't agree more with you. And there's a couple of things on this. So there's two elements, or two dimensions. One is the role of business, as you talked about, and so I would certainly have to, firstly, and I won't discuss it here, but to disagree with the individualism thing. That was a psychological point, not a actual reality thing. So that's the state of being. But nevertheless, technology will play a big role. I think technology can play a big role, will play a big role, but without the right set of values underpinning that technology, it could be more damaging than we think. So I was at Rehab Week maybe back in July. The amount of robots that are coming onto the market from Japan, from China, from the US, that cost at the moment still $40,000, $50,000, but very quickly within the next 10 years they'll be at $5,000. These robots can pretty much are starting to do 30-40% of a carer's role. And I saw it with my own eyes. They can make you a brilliant cup of tea. One of them did it for me. They can talk to you. They can have a conversation with you because they're learning about your habits and your traits. So technology will play a role, and I think technology manufacturers, technology businesses, this is a huge market, a huge commercial market. But without the right underlying set of values, which I am arguing here for dharmic underpinning values, all you will do is you would, what's the word I suppose, that the technology that we end up creating might beg the question. The very thing we're trying to solve is loneliness. The very thing we're trying to solve is human bonding. The very thing we're trying to solve is the transfer of values and knowledge from one generation to the next generation. Now, unless we build the robots in the right type of way, and unless the businesses engage with this challenge in the right frame of mind, we'll miss the point. And somebody will get very rich and somebody will get left behind.
And a very sad statistic to support that is in a research project where elderly people who lived alone were interviewed. Something like between 76 and 80% of them said that their company, their friend that they consider the closest to them is their television. And I'm not sure that's a world we want to live in.
Can I just say that some of those solutions that you mentioned about the nursery and about the students living, I think that's the kind of radical thinking we need. That is the kind of thinking we need to have. And for that to really go beyond just a petri dish, right? Like some small community in Netherlands, and it really becoming a cultural phenomena. Again, I come back to it. We have to look at our underlying values. We have to go beyond the utilitarian thinking that I should live with this old person because I get a free room out of it. That's fine.
Just in terms of echoing some further thoughts on that, actually, because I think you're right about the fact that there is a generation here right now where we can actually think a little bit more forward about how we develop some solutions as well. And I think the one thing which I still go back to the premise of is actually, I think these solutions actually are going to be great solutions as sort of, what do you call them? You feed them by spoon, so you just keep feeding them because you create the structures, but ultimately what you want is the utopian world where actually everyone just looks after everyone. Yeah, and to get to that world, we do need to kind of think a little bit further ahead than just the immediate problem that we have, which is actually, even in the context of Facebook and things like that, is solve the problem. But in the wider scheme, are we creating greater separation than inclusion? And we need to think those aspects. What I would say in all of this is that I think there's sometimes decisions are made on behalf of others as well, and we need to really include everyone in the concept of when you create innovation. I look at my mum, for example, and many of us who here know my mum. She's approaching 70 at the moment, and my dad passed away, almost 19, 20 years ago. And in that context, she made a conscious choice that actually, for not to move in with me because she wants to actually live her own life in her own way as well. And I keep seeing that. I can see her cane is going to transform and change at some point. But in the decision making, I want to make sure she's included in that process of how we decide that, for her perspective, where does she want her well-being to be. And I think this is where technology sometimes takes a slightly different view, where it actually imposes a solution without constantly actually including the people that are going to use it into that decision making. And we need to make that society be that society where actually our best interests are that everyone looks after everyone. If we create that society eventually, if that is going to be the best world, then there's no issues of generational gaps. There's no issues of saying that actually I'm only going to look after my parent because you go look after yours. Yeah, it's got to be about actually let's look after each other, and that is the right way we need to go about thinking about innovation, about how we develop policy, how we develop systems, how we representative of everything, but including eventually, don't make decisions on other people's behalf, if that makes sense. We have to include everyone in that decision making.
Thank you. We are very pressed for time, so I will have one final question. I must say, before we go on to that though, if you do have any more questions, feel free to speak to the panelists afterwards, or use our social media handles, Vichar_Manthan, and tweet in your question. We can bombard the panelists with questions for you and then get back to you. And we just have one final question, but okay, you go first.
Yeah, you may not agree with me because Asian community got bigger problem. The reason is because we are all capitalist oriented. Because we all living in the same houses, you know, when the children grow up, they move on. If you go to Europe, you go to Germany, you go to Netherlands, you got all around there, mostly rented accommodation. Because if you see the single people living in, mostly in the big houses, 2 or 3 bedroom or 4 bedroom, and the husband and wife. And they're getting lonely, no one to talk to, because they're not able to move near their children or anywhere. Because the thing is, mobility, because they can't, because they're not going to leave the house. They want to leave £1 million to their children. And I think that's where the bigger problem is in this country, because 66% of the Indian origin in this country own their own houses. This is official figures, it's not mine, it's the census one. And because this is the reason, that's why they're away from their families, and the children can't help them because they move up in a different town with a job and all that. Because as long as we're not able to move into the smaller places, the only solution is the socialism. If they're the socialism, they had to build the houses there where the people elderly live up all there together, they can move up, or the council can rent those houses from the people and use accommodation. I think this is the only solution. There's no other way you can help the people living in a 4 bedroom, somebody going to look after, and the son is living 200 miles away. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Membaji. Okay, so, sorry, I'm not going to be able to answer any more questions, but one last question over there, and then we must close. I'm very sorry about that, but please tweet us. Yes, so just to repeat, the frame of reference needs to be rethought. There was an Indian story where...
It was not an Indian story, but someone from, I think, Eastern Europe.
Someone from Eastern Europe told a story where in a kingdom all the elders were removed, and within a certain amount of time the entire kingdom, the entire society collapsed. What a delightful thought to end this Vichar-Manthan with. Thank you for engaging in the discussion and asking so many questions, and thank you to our panelists for being so insightful, and I hope you're full of solutions and full of ways that we can implement a more ethical, dharmic way of viewing our elders, discussing their route home. Okay, and just over to Panditji for a final word.
In the dharmic context, there is the last bit is called the Banprasth Ashram. You know it? No? Yes. So what happens at certain, it was in about 75 years of age in olden times. Now after the retirement, parents move away from kids. Okay? So I'm not asking the parents to move away from kids. The meaning of Vanprasth Ashram was, do not interfere into the day-to-day life of your kids. That includes your son-in-law and daughter-in-law. It's very, very important. It's for on the part of the elders. And another very important part of Hindu Dharma is tithe. In English we say, but we say dhan. दान के बिना कुछ नहीं है. Whatever you have given the solution, either the private sector solution, government solution, and nobody has talked about the charity. Our kids have moved so far away. So not far away means they have gone too high, and they are in a very much better position financially than their parents. And in Hindu Dharma, when the wedding is done, at that time, one of the vows is that both of us are promising to contribute something to a charity. That can be religious, spiritual, or any charity. So wherever we need, why can't we promise from today to create a charity to look after the elderly person. We should keep on pressing on government or whatever agencies you need to take help, but we can create some charity and look after the elderly person here. And very important, the last point is, we all are talking about the dharma. All of you place your hand on your heart and tell me, not in words, just in your heart only, do you have temple in your vicinity? How much you are involved in your temple? Mr. Gupta told, and that was the Milan Center closed. I was associated with a Milan Center. It was a shock and pain to us also. How many of you are associated with the temples in your area? You have got such a wonderful temple in Slough. If you are local, go talk to the temple committee or whoever are managing it, and that's we need one few hours a day in the temple for the elderly people. And if you are involving in the temple, you will see there is a space and there is infrastructure that can be provided. But you are not asking this question. Everything we are saying, they are very, very good for writing a book, and very nice thing, very practical things also for impressing on the government and on our kids also. But practically, what can we do? And you have many good experts over here. If you come to the temple and say, this is 1 hour of my time, 1 hour in a month, I can teach this IT or how to handle the smartphone to the elderly person. Will that not be a help? Will that not bring the society together? Will not bring the elderly and youngsters together? So these are the practical things we are not thinking about it. You have got every solution around you. Please try it tomorrow. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you very much, Panditji, and thank you to all the panelists and audience for joining us today. I'm going to hand over to Ritu for final remarks and closing statements.
I'd firstly like to thank our panel for taking time out of their busy schedule to be here with us today. We really appreciate that and we really value this. I'd also like to thank the school for allowing us to use their facilities. I'd also like to thank you for being here today, because without you we wouldn't be able to hold this event. And finally, I'd also like to thank Giran Jirawal, our videographer, because without you guys we wouldn't be able to hold an event like this. Along with you being here today, we also have financial support through the Well Wishers Fund. So again, without that as well, we wouldn't be able to run these events. So these events do cost money to run, and as mentioned, we are a voluntary organisation, so we would appreciate local support and would welcome you all to be a well-wisher, to donate either £1 or more a month. You can find Monica G and Falguni G for more information, who will be downstairs at the desk, and you can ask them your questions and whatnot. If anybody wants to get involved with their local VM chapter, then please reach out to me or Garunaji here at the front. We can give you more information on that. And finally, we also have a VM in London on the 1st of December at the High Commission of India in London. It's titled, Is Corbyn's Socialism the Right Answer for the Apparent Failure of Capitalism, or Is There a Genuine Third Way? You can find more details of this on the Vijayamanthan website or the Vijayamanthan Facebook page. Don't forget to provide your feedback on the feedback forms that you've been given, and we'll be collecting these on your way out. And again, as Vidhu mentioned, don't forget to interact with us on social media. So if you do have any questions, then you can tweet us or drop a comment on our Facebook page. Thank you.